Welcome to Manifested Publishers.
Welcome, my dear learner, to our today's lesson. We are continuing with our history and government. And remember, we are looking at the topic European invasion of Africa and the process of colonization. And we have been looking at the factors that led to the scramble and partition of Africa. So, my dear learners, as we have looked in our previous lessons, I just want us to have a very brief recap of what we have done. We have been looking at the factors that led to the scramble and partition of Africa. We said a scramble is a sudden rush to, right? So when you talk of the scramble for Africa, it's when European powers were rushing to get portions of the African continent. And then the partitioning of Africa is the division of the African continent into portions among the European powers. So we have been looking at what are the factors that led to this scramble for and partition of Africa. So in our previous lessons, we have looked at the political factors. We looked at the political factors, and then we also looked at number 2, the social factors, which are also sometimes referred to as humanitarian factors. So, my dear learner, are you able to remember the political factors that we mentioned that led to the scramble for the European powers? Are you able to remember them? We discussed three political factors that led to the scramble of the African continent. Can you remember them, my dear learner? Yes, we mentioned the unification of Germany. Then we looked at militarism, right? And then we looked at nationalism. When we looked at the social factors, we looked at the different social factors that led to the scramble and partition of Africa. My dear learners, that was what we looked at in our last lesson. Are you able to remember the social factors? Yes, you can check at your notes. Now, today we are going to look at the economic factors. We're going to look at the economic factors that led to the scramble and partition of Africa. What are these economic? Remember, when we talk of economic, we are looking at things to do with livelihood, right? Economic, the livelihood part of life of history that led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. So, my dear learner, this is our lesson objective for today. So, the objective that I want you to achieve, So, by the end of this lesson, my dear learner, I want you to be able to state the economic factors that led to scramble. State the economic factors that led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. So, my dear learners, let us look at what are these economic factors that led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. So, the economic factors, that is what we are looking at. The economic factors. Remember, this is our third category of factors that have led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. So, my dear learner, the first factor that we are going to look at is trade. Trade. Remember, in your Form 2 work, we defined what trade is. We said trade is the exchange of goods and services, right? So trade is a factor that led to the process of colonization or to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. How? The traders who had come to Africa required protection. So the traders requested for protection. The traders requested for protection from their mother countries. So they needed soldiers, they needed military men to come and protect their trade interest. And as we are going to be discussing in our following lessons, we are going to look at, we are going to see how the companies were established to lead the trade in Africa. So these traders that came to Africa, remember they had just come to trade, normal trade. Remember when we were talking of the social factors, we said they needed to establish a legitimate trade or abolish the slave trade. So the traders who came with the interest of just having a good trade needed protection because some African communities were hostile to them. So when the military or the army men came to protect them, it resulted or it interested the European powers to get colonies permanently, where that now could become the place of trade. That is when you talk of trade. Number two, the next economic factor is minerals. So there existed minerals. The explorers that came initially before the process of colonization started, they discovered that there were mineral deposits. There were mineral deposits. There were mineral deposits. There are mineral deposits in the interior of Africa. Which are these mineral deposits? An example is gold. An example is gold that was found in South Africa. Just giving an example. South Africa. So these interested people to come to South Africa because there is gold. Another example of mineral was diamond, which was found in the Central Africa, right? The Congo, right? So European powers were interested in different parts of Africa because of the minerals that were found in these places. There you can get many different examples, right? Even in West Africa, there were minerals that interested the European powers to come and get a portion of the African continent. And then number three, the next economic factor, we can talk of industrialization. Industrialization in Europe. Industrialization in Europe. Remember, we are talking of the 19th century. This is the period where we saw increased development of industries. So these industries required raw materials. These industries led to provision of finished goods, right? So industrialization, the development of industries in Europe, the industries that developed in Europe necessitated the European powers to come and find a source for raw materials. They needed to get a place where they could get markets for the goods they had produced in their industries. So they came or they were competing, right, for this for this market that had been found in Africa. So industrialization was a big factor, economic factor, that made the European powers to come and get colonies in Africa. So when you talk of industrialization, just the mere existence of an industry in the European powers. So you find they were starting to compete against each other. Which European power has more industries? And when you have more industries, you want to go and expand your market. You want to go and expand the base of your raw materials. That is the next factor. Let us look at our next factor, that economic factor that necessitated or resulted to the scramble and partition of Africa. There was investment of surplus capital. So, as a result of industrialization, there was a development of a class of merchants, a class of wealthy merchants. There was development of a class of wealthy merchants. These are the people who owned the industries. They developed a lot of capital or wealth. So you have a lot of wealth. Where do you take it? So they found that they could come and invest in the African continent. Why the African continent? There was less competition. There was less competition because in Europe, everybody has built an industry, right? They are investing there. There are a lot of wealthy people there. So most of them opted to come and invest in Africa where there is less competition. So these merchants had a lot of wealth which they needed to invest somewhere. You want to reinvest whatever you have gotten. So that was a factor that encouraged the European powers to come into Africa. So these wealthy merchants came and invested in the African continent. So that is about investment of surplus capital. So let us look at our second last reason or economic factor that encouraged European powers to come and scramble or to come and partition or divide the African continent amongst themselves. So number 5, the next factor, the next economic factor. Remember, we are talking of economic factor. So was search for new markets. Search for new markets. So with industrialization in Europe, with development of more industries, right? There were more finished goods. There were more finished goods that needed to be sold. The European population could not provide enough market for the goods that had been produced. So the Africans provided a market, a ready market. Actually, we can add that, provided a ready market. Because in Africa, there are no industries at that time. So the goods that are being produced by the European powers have not been exposed to the African market. So the European powers were motivated to come and bring their goods to Africa. So they had to get a portion for themselves. Like, for example, we talked of the Germans, we talked of the British, we talked of the French, right? Each and every European power wanted to get a place where they could be selling what they have produced back in their motherland. And then, my dear Lana, let us look at the last economic factor that fueled the coming of the European powers into Africa, right? We talk of search for raw materials. Search for raw materials. What is a raw material? A raw material is a requirement for you to produce a finished product. So Africa produced a huge base for raw materials. Where were these raw materials needed? They were needed in the European industries. So the European powers came to secure a source. They needed a source that was steady. A source that was steady. And then another reason, cheap. The African source was cheap because the Africans had not been exposed to the value of what they were producing. So it was cheap to acquire raw materials in Africa than it was to acquire in the European continent. So the European powers rushed or scrambled to come and get a portion of Africa so that they could get a steady supply of the raw materials, and these raw materials they would acquire them in cheaply. That means they would make more profit when they come to sell. So my dear learner, the raw materials, what are these raw materials that were being sold? An example, we can talk of cotton, right? That is what was being planted, right? And then they introduced cocoa, which is majorly in West Africa. Then there was tobacco, right? That was being sold there. And then there was rubber. Remember, it is during the time of industrialization. So there are more things that are being produced. So these raw materials were easily found in Africa, and these encouraged the European powers to come and invest, to come and get a portion. Remember, we are talking of scramble and partition. So they rushed to get a portion of the African continent. So my dear learner, we have looked at the economic factors that resulted or that necessitated or that encouraged the European powers to come and get a portion, scramble for part of the African continent. We have talked of trade as number one. We have talked of minerals as number two. We have talked of industrialization, the beginning of industries, right? We have talked of investment of surplus capital, the wealthy merchants. And then we have looked at the in search of markets. They required markets for the goods their industries had produced. And lastly, we have looked at raw materials. So my dear learner, I'm sure now you are able to state and explain, right, the different economic factors that encouraged or that led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. So as we come to the end of our lesson, let me give you this quick question. Question to help you revise what we have just looked at. So, and the question is, my dear learner, state. So, my dear learner, as you attempt this question, look at the marks that you have been given here. 10 marks. And the question is state and explain. So in history, that means you have to state the factor and then explain how that factor, briefly, how that factor led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. And we have done that, or I have tried to explain to you, giving you different ideas of how these factors led to the scramble and partitioning of Africa. And that brings us to the end of our lesson today. Bye-bye.
Thank you for choosing to study with us. For more information, you can call us on 0724 173845.